Hi, everyone. Welcome to the ARC's National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability webinar. My name is Catherine Walker, and I'm today's facilitator. Before we begin our presentation, I'd like to cover a few rules. Because there are so many of you, all participants are currently in listen-only mode. At any time during the presentation, if you need help, you can post a question in the chat box on the side of your screen. We'll be happy to help you. At the end of the session, there will be a time for questions. You can either post your questions in the Q&A section or the chat box. If you want your question to stay private, type private before your question. You can also email questions to nccjdinfo@thearc.org. If we don't get to your question during the presentation, we'll follow up with you afterward. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website. We will send you an email letting you know when it's available. During the presentation, you'll be asked to answer a few polling questions. These questions help us document your involvement for our funders, so please participate. We have one final request. You'll receive a session evaluation after this webinar. Please take 5 minutes to complete and send it to us. The webinar is funded by the United States Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance. Thanks for your participation. Today's webinar is the 9th of NCCJD's monthly webinars and features Eileen Bisgard and Dawnmarie Bisgard. Before we welcome them, we'd like to go and do our 5 polling questions. Our 5 true or false questions. The first one is true or false. FASD is a diagnosis given by an MD. The second, true or false. Specific facial features are required for a diagnosis of FASD. The third, 50% of adults with an FASD will be in trouble with the law. Number 4, individuals with FASDs may not understand when they are being arrested. And number 5, probation is more effective than incarceration in changing the behavior of an individual with an FASD. All right, can you guys turn on your video? You've got to click the camera.
I don't see the camera.
All right, we'll just troubleshoot here for just a second. If you can take a look at the little gear in the top right-hand corner and see if we can find your camera there, and if not, we'll go right on with audio.
Right.
Sorry, I lost your audio for a second there. Do you see the gear in the top right-hand corner for set video options?
It brought up the picture and I clicked OK, but then it doesn't show me the picture.
All right, I guess we'll just have to keep moving without video then. We can hear you just fine, so if you want to go ahead and get started.
Okay. Obviously, we're going to try to cover a lot of material in this session, so we're going to be moving fairly quickly, but I want to do an overview of what fetal alcohol spectrum disorders are, basic information about that, and then talk about legal issues. Wish we could get on the video. Okay. Now I don't have control of the PowerPoint.
You should be able to move the PowerPoint. There we go.
Resolution, urging attorneys and judges, bar associations, law school clinical programs, and other agencies to help identify and respond effectively to fetal alcohol spectrum disorders in children and adults through training to enhance awareness of FASD and its impact on individuals in the child welfare, juvenile justice, and adult criminal justice systems, and the value of collaboration with medical, mental health, and disability experts. They passed this resolution because they recognize how important this issue is in the judicial system. And they further urged passage of laws and adoption of policies at all levels of government that acknowledge and treat the effects of prenatal alcohol exposure and better assist individuals with FASD. What is the impact of FASD? At least 1 in 100 children born in America have an FASD. Studies estimate that each individual born with an FASD will average well over $2 million in services over a lifetime, and these costs do not count the cost of incarceration. Individuals with FASD have higher odds of being arrested than individuals in other parts of the population. The University of Washington did a study a number of years ago where they looked at over 400 individuals that have been diagnosed with something on what we now call the FASD spectrum. 30% of those individuals, the adults, had been in jail at some point, and 50% had been in trouble with the law. They later did a study in a number of California jails, and in the ones they studied, 2/3 of the adult male prisoners could be diagnosed with an FASD. So what is FASD? What are fetal alcohol spectrum disorders? Well, basically, it is an entire spectrum, and on the most obvious end of the spectrum is fetal alcohol spectrum, fetal alcohol syndrome, or full FAS. It is a medical diagnosis, but only FAS is a medical diagnosis. It requires that the individual be in the 5th to 10th percentile as far as growth, height, weight, or head circumference, that they have specific facial features, that they have cognitive deficits in at least three different areas of functioning, and that there be proof that they were prenatally exposed to alcohol. However, there are 10 times as many people who have cognitive deficits and prenatal exposure as who do not have the physical features. So these individuals are on a whole spectrum, and the term fetal alcohol spectrum disorders has been created to look at the entire spectrum of any individuals who are prenatally exposed to alcohol and have cognitive deficits as a result of that. So FASD itself is not a diagnosis. It's a term to talk about the broad spectrum of diagnoses. There is a new diagnosis that's been added in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the 5th version, the DSM-V, and that is NBCAE, or neurobehavioral disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure. This is in the appendix to the DSM-V, but it's a term that we're excited about getting involved with using and getting more research on so that it can be turned into a diagnosis that can maybe be given by a psychologist. So what are the issues with fetal alcohol? Well, when a woman drinks, the alcohol goes into her bloodstream. If she's pregnant, it goes through her bloodstream and into through the umbilical cord and into the, maybe you can get the camera on. Yes. Okay, it goes through the umbilical cord and into the fetus. Whatever part of the fetus is developing at the time that the alcohol gets into the fetus may be affected by that alcohol. What we're most concerned about are issues of brain development. And in layman's terms, and very rough, all our brains are made up of billions of neurons and neuroconnectors, and they're all formed right at the base of the skull where the arrows are pointing. Then they're held together with fatty tissue and they migrate to the parts of the brain that they're supposed to be in. And we know now that different parts of the brain control different cognitive functions. Well, what happens when we introduce alcohol into that system? I'm glad we got the video on because I brought an egg. Obviously, I don't carry around a fetus, but I got an egg out of my refrigerator, and I'm going to break it into a clear cup so we can take a look at it. So here's the egg in this cup, and now we're going to add alcohol, and I'm actually using rubbing alcohol. So I'm going to put rubbing alcohol on that egg, and hopefully in the camera you can see that it's already starting to essentially cook that egg. The egg white is turning actually white rather than clear. And maybe we can come back and look at that later. The longer we leave it, the worse it will get. So essentially what that shows is that when alcohol gets into living tissue, it changes the consistency of that living tissue. And that's what happens in our brain. As the alcohol gets into the bloodstream, gets into the brain of the developing fetus, it affects whatever neurons are developing, and it affects that fatty tissue that holds those neurons together as they migrate to different parts of the brain, so that some of the neurons will fall off, some may go to the wrong parts of the brain, and some of them will actually die. So we actually end up with a child who has a smaller brain than they would otherwise be expected to have. This is a picture of the brain of an infant who is diagnosed by autopsy with fetal alcohol syndrome, and the brain of an infant about the same size and gestational age that was a typical child that whose mother did not drink. And you can see that the brain affected by fetal alcohol is smaller. It's missing this midsection down between the two halves of the brain. This is not a blank area as it looks like, but rather it's all full of neuroconnectors that help the two sides of the brain to talk to each other. So that is the part of the brain that is most commonly missing in children that are affected by prenatal alcohol exposure. You'll also notice that this brain is much less complex than the typical brain, and that's because it doesn't have all the rich neurons that it's supposed to have. If the individual does not have the neuroconnectors connecting more analytical part of their brain with the more artistic part of their brain, then that individual cannot think abstractly. And that is key to the way that an individual with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder thinks and processes. Now, every individual that has a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is different. It depends on when during the pregnancy the mother drank. It depends on how much she drank, whether she was drinking regularly or binging, and also some genetic factors. Genetic factors in both the mother and the fetus, so that some women, yes, can drink during their pregnancy and their child may not be affected. Other women may only have a drink or two, or maybe go to one party and drink a couple glasses of champagne, and their child will be affected. So, and then everyone is affected in a different way. And this is not something that we're trying to blame mothers for, because irreversible damage can be caused to the fetus before the mother even knows that she's pregnant. So even if the mother finds out she's pregnant and quits drinking, there can be damage to the child. Any part of the body can be affected. Some of the physical things that we see are premature birth, small size or slow growth, which is part of the diagnosis of FAS, vision and hearing deficits, heart problems, problems with other organs. It tends to be pieces down the things that are in the center part of the body. Improper bone development, that can be any of the bones. Dyslexia is a huge issue, and lower IQ. However, just a side note that just because someone has a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or even if they have full fetal alcohol syndrome, does not mean that they necessarily have an IQ that would qualify them for intellectual disability services. The average IQ for someone with an FASD that is not full fetal alcohol syndrome is about 10 points below the average for the typical population, or about 90. And for those with FAS, the average is about, about 20 points lower, or about 80. Okay, if I can get it to go to the next slide here. Okay, this slide can say more than I can possibly say about the physical effects. Obviously, the chick on your left, the mother was given alcohol. The chick on the right, the mother was not. And you can see that even the claws and the face and everything are affected. Every species of animal has essentially the same facial features as humans when they are exposed to alcohol. So what kinds of cognitive effects are we looking at? That's what we're most concerned about. The biggest one is what we call executive function, or in lay terms, difficulty making decisions. As I said, individuals that are affected very often cannot think abstractly. If they can't think abstractly, they cannot understand cause and effect, or what the results of their behavior will be. If you can't understand what the results of a decision are going to be, then you have no way of making a good decision. You have nothing to relate that to. So individuals who can't think abstractly tend to make impulsive decisions rather than decisions that are thought through. Another very common issue is poor short-term memory. It tends to be short-term, not long-term memory that's affected. sometimes that memory comes and goes. So one day a person can follow directions or remember something specific, and the next day they may not be able to do either of those things. The day after, they may be able to again, which drives parents crazy, it drives teachers crazy, and I'm sure it drives police officers crazy. If you have poor short-term memory, you probably cannot follow directions. You'll often see these individuals trying to follow directions and follow the first one and then can't remember what they were supposed to do next. As I said, thinking abstractly is a big issue. Some of the really abstract things in our world are time and money. So these are things that people have a real difficult time with. And it's not just telling time, it's understanding the concept of time. Understanding how long it is between now and an hour from now, or now until the next birthday, or now until when they need to emancipate, and so on. They live in a world where there is not a clear understanding of how long it's going to take for anything. Another thing that we see very typically in these individuals is that they have wide differences in abilities. Some may think completely visually, others may think completely auditorily. Some will say things that they really don't understand. They know what they're supposed to say, but they don't understand what that means. Others may understand a whole lot, but they can't get the words out, they can't express it. A lot of these individuals think slowly, and so they miss part of what's said, and therefore misinterpret the whole conversation. A lot of us think slowly. I know for me, very often after I'm involved in a conversation or ask a question, then I'll go away and I'll think, oh, I wish I'd said this. Now I'm thinking about it. Well, this happens on a much greater scale with an individual who processes even slower than I do. Very often, these individuals have minds that are disorganized, and so they can't organize their life either. They tend to be very distractible. They may have trouble paying attention because they're distracted by things around them. They may be, as we're going to talk about in a minute, hypersensitive to what they see or what they hear, and that may distract them. They often have a very difficult time with any kind of change, whether it's going to a new environment, being around different people, or whatever. And for kids, when they get to middle school and high school, where they're changing from one class to another, it can be devastating for them. And all of these things are magnified when these individuals are under stress. Sensory issues are huge for this population. They may be either over or under sensitive to any of the areas: touch, visual stimulation, auditory stimulation, smell, foods and textures, even gravity and where they are in space, which can cause real boundary issues. Those are the things I've just talked about, are all things that are because of the brain differences in these individuals. Yes, they are things that these individuals can't help. This is the way they are. This is the way their brains are put together, and so that's how they respond to the world. Very often, we, the people and the adults working with them, misinterpret them and think that they responded the way they did because they're acting out, that they didn't follow directions because they didn't try, or they didn't respond right away when we asked them something because they weren't paying attention, rather than because their brain processes slowly and so on. So then they develop learned behaviors. Very often they become angry or violent because they're so frustrated by what's going on around them. Others may avoid, or at another time an individual may just avoid the whole situation. They don't understand, so they're going to shut it out. They're going to think of something else. Or they may actually get to the point of going in their room and slamming the door and just wanting to be alone, or running away. Alcohol and drug use is another way to avoid a situation. Others may try to take control of their environment so that it's something that they do understand. So they may become bossy, they may become bullies. And others may become so anxious that they're just fearful of the world around them all the time, and they may even become sick or complain of being sick in order to get their needs met, because they really don't have the words to ask or the understanding of their own body to ask to have their needs met. Depression is huge in this population, and I almost want to take it out of here because I would certainly be depressed if I was dealing with this kind of issues and being misunderstood by the world. A lot of mental health diagnoses are given to this population. ADD and ADHD are almost, it seems like, with the kids that I work with, it seems like they all get that diagnosis. A lot because they're distractible, they're impulsive, and they do like to move around. So they get that diagnosis, but it may not be a valid diagnosis. So those medications may actually create depression in the individuals rather than solving their problem. Reactive attachment disorder is a common diagnosis. Depression, as I talked about. Sensory integration disorder, which is simply the diagnosis for those sensory issues that these individuals have. Conduct disorder, and sort of the diagnosis of choice is bipolar disorders. My personal layperson's rule of thumb is when I see a kid getting their third different diagnosis from the same or a different therapist, I'm inclined to say let's look for something cognitive, something more overreaching. But this is why a lot of these individuals get on a huge number of medications, because they get these diagnoses and then the medications don't respond the way the therapist thinks they should. So what kind of legal issues are we talking about? This population tends to confess to crimes. They're very suggestible. They want to plead, and if they don't understand, they may try to say what they think the person wants to hear. Or they, in order to fit in with a group that has committed a crime, they may admit to the crime even though they weren't really the one that committed it. They tend to be poor witnesses because of both those sort of false confessions, because they may not have totally understood what was going on, and they may not be able to remember what happened or what they said about it. So they may say one thing to the police officer, another thing on the witness stand, and another thing to their attorney who is trying to prepare them for the witness stand. Competency issues are huge. Competency to consent to search, to waive the Miranda rights, to plead guilty, and then also competency to stand trial. Although in most states they will not be found incompetent to stand trial under the kinds of requirements that the states have, but in fact they aren't competent to help their attorney represent them. Often these individuals typically they have a lack of capacity to premeditate crime. So if it's a premeditated type of crime, they probably didn't do it. Dawnmarie is here with me today, and I would like to tell you a little bit about her, and then I'm going to talk to her, ask her some questions from the defendant's perspective. Dawnmarie was diagnosed with partial fetal alcohol syndrome when she was 13 years old. At that time, she was hospitalized, and from there she went into a number of placements, residential treatment, group homes, foster homes, before she was able to come back to us. After she was diagnosed with an intellectual disability at age 16, so 3 years later, she then got into disability services. But after she stole a car, she was placed out of home again, but this time through the disabilities program. After 13 years in disability services, Dawnmarie has now left these services and is instead working as a staff person in a behavioral program for individuals with intellectual disabilities. She's turned the tables. She lives independently with her boyfriend. Dawn has been arrested, and she has agreed to talk to us about what that felt like to her as an individual with partial FAS. Dawn, what was the most serious charge that you've been arrested for? What happened?
The staff didn't like me, so they would stuff my head into pillows or pull me off the couch to put me in a restraint when I was sleeping because they said that I was dangerous. When one of the staff put her arm around my throat, I bit her shoulder. I was happy when the police were called because I thought that they would help me get out of there. I didn't understand what was happening when they arrested me. I was the victim. I only bit her to get out of there. But they arrested me for assault and put me in jail. When I tried to tell the police what happened, the most I did was
Have you ever been in any other situation where you tried to tell a police officer that you didn't understand why you were being arrested?
yes.
What happened?
The guy threatened to tease me, threw me onto the ground, threw me in the back of the car, and took me to jail. After my roommates and the neighbors called the supervisor and told them what happened, they called and got me.
How did you feel about police after these situations?
I became afraid of them, and I still am.
How does it feel to be arrested?
Scary, but you also don't understand how it's going to feel, what skill is going to be about, what will happen in court. Also, I don't usually wear anything on my arms because of the sensory issues. So handcuffs are a problem. And when they put them on me, I didn't know if it was going to be permanent. Also, because I have a history of being abused and handcuffs can set off PTSD.
What should police officers do rather than arrest a person in a situation like yours?
If staff call the police when a client is out of control, they could help de-escalate the situation rather than arrest someone. Staff and facilities shouldn't press charges on their clients. A criminal record is not going to help them learn different behavior. If a client runs away, the police can help them get home. If they are with a dangerous person, they can help them get out of the situation and back to the facility.
Since you're working as staff in the disability community now, do you have any other advice for police?
If someone from the disability community or a facility needs to call the police, they should state that it is someone with a disability that they are calling about. If you know that the client has negative attention, ask the police to talk to staff rather than directly to the client. Tell them that the person may be afraid and may not understand what's happening. Ask them to reassure the client that they are there to help. If you can, do what the police did for me when I was a teenager. They had one woman who always responded when there was a call about me, and she always reassured me first when she came.
Thank you, Dawn. We'll ask you another question or two toward the end. So, in summary, in order to incorporate FASD awareness in arrest situations, an officer should look at and ask themselves whether the individual seems to understand the crime that's being charged and why they're being charged with it. Does the person expect to be charged, or did they see you as someone who is there to help them? If there's a confession, was it valid? Are the suspect and other witnesses telling a consistent story? One way to try to determine if it's valid. Ask if there's a support person the suspect would like you to call. And please, if there is a support person, believe that support person. So often that people don't believe us, especially with someone like Dawnmarie, who looks perfectly normal, talks perfectly normal, and seems to be just fine. Try to determine whether the suspect is from a family with alcohol use abuse issues. One thing to look at to try to determine if this is an issue. Is the suspect in disability services? That should be a clue. Was the suspect in foster care or adopted? And please, again, listen to the family or other support people when they come. Typical crimes related to FASD or committed by individuals who have an FASD are impulsive crimes, such as shoplifting something for immediate consumption rather than a long-term gain, stealing from a friend or neighbor, something for personal use. One of my favorite stories from when I was working with juvenile probation was a young man who took the keys out of a neighbor's car and went into their house to get something to drink out of the refrigerator and was sitting at the kitchen table drinking it when the family got home. He was arrested for burglary. He had no idea what he had done wrong. Getting into a fight from overreacting to a seemingly mild provocation, such as Dawn did. Behavior precipitated by panic or flight, which is actually also what happened to her. Secondary involvement in crimes with more sophisticated people. Again, I remember a story of a woman that I worked with who was given money to move into, she was homeless, and she was given money to move into a facility that rented rooms from week to week. When she went in and got her room, initially the landlady told her that she would reduce her rent if she would run errands for her. And of course she was happy to do that. Little did she know that the errands were delivering drugs to people in the various apartment units. She was arrested for drug dealing, and to the best of my knowledge, the landlady was never convicted of anything because no one believed the individual with FAS. Other indicators of that this might be an individual with an FASD is if they're the only one apprehended in a crime with multiple more sophisticated perpetrators. If there are a group of teens in a car and the police come up behind them, the car pulls over and all but one run away, and then one comes over to the police officer and says that they're the one that stole the car. Stop and think about that. Is that really accurate? Repeated minor offenses with no escalation of the severity of crime. Absence of offenses that require significant planning or premeditation. Again, planning is not likely to be in the mix for an individual with an FASD. And a history of minor offenses before age 18 is another indicator. Behavior that indicates lack of boundaries or understanding appropriate behavior, such as touching. One issue that can be huge, unfortunately, with teens with an FASD is they may be emotionally at a much younger level, and we sometimes find teens who are playing what they think is a game of you show me yours, I'll show you mine, with a 5 or 6-year-old or a 4 or 5-year-old, because this is developmentally inappropriate behavior for them. But of course, it's not appropriate for that teenager, and they're going to end up on the sex offender registry. People with a past failure of probation or parole based upon not being able to follow directions, not attending their appointments, not showing up for court, not coming in at curfew, and so on. Lack of remorse based on the fact that they don't understand the seriousness of the crime, or maybe even that they committed a crime. And then lack of understanding of the connection between crime and punishment. A diagnosis is required in order to be absolutely sure that an individual is affected by an FASD, but unfortunately, diagnosis is not readily available in most places, and especially not for an adult. But indications or evidence of prenatal exposure, or just coming from a family with a history of alcohol use and or neurobehavioral deficits are indicators that we can look for. A neuropsychological evaluation of the individual will show whether they have those neurobehavioral deficits, although it will not directly lead to a diagnosis of an FASD. If there's a serious crime, and it's really important to have that individual diagnosed, there is a diagnostic team available, and you need to contact the University of Washington Fetal Alcohol and Drug Unit, and they can arrange for this team to come out and diagnose the adult that is being worked with. Some courts, if they understand the issues of FASD, will accept factors that indicate a likelihood of FASD if you can present sufficient evidence. Things like we just talked about, family history of substance abuse, history of adoption or foster care, siblings who are diagnosed with FASD, multiple mental health diagnoses, evidence of cognitive or functional deficits, history of criminal behaviors that make no sense or provide no gain for the individual. When these individuals are being sentenced, they may be less culpable. If it was an impulsive crime or they were not the leader in the crime, they are not as culpable as if it was something that they planned and did intentionally. And again, they may not understand why they're being punished. So they can be incarcerated for as long as you want. That's not necessarily going to help them to learn not to do the behavior if they don't understand why they're in jail. Also, these individuals tend to be followers, tend to be gullible, and consequently, they're easily victimized in prison. What they benefit from, what can really help them, is a very structured community-based sentence like probation rather than incarceration. They need extra support as well that can make that probation successful. They need their terms and conditions of probation to be clear and concrete. They need reminders of appointments, of court dates, of curfews. And in this day and age, they can have help setting their cell phones so that they get those reminders, as well as maybe a phone call from someone to remind them of what they need to do. If you have adolescent sex offenders who have FASDs, they should be treated individually and in a very concrete manner. What we don't want is to get these teens into a group where everyone's talking about the sex offense that they committed, because that's going to be school for these kids. They're going to learn how to do something that really is a sex offense, when what they did may not have been intended as a sex offense, although of course it was, or they wouldn't have been convicted of that. Substance abuse treatment needs to be concrete. House arrest, not being able to get near the substances, spending long enough with very concrete programs so that they get rid of the addiction. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, SAMHSA, sponsored two, actually more programs than just the two, but there are two programs that for about 6 years screened juveniles in a court in Colorado and one in Minnesota, screening kids who were on probation. Here in Colorado, we screened every juvenile that was placed on probation, primarily by taking a picture and interviewing their mothers to see whether they drank during the pregnancy and then getting them diagnosed. What we found is that nearly 16% of all those on probation were diagnosed with some kind of a cognitive deficit, and the mother acknowledged that she drank during the pregnancy, at least to the probation officer, even if she went to the actual evaluation and denied it. They did a similar study in Minneapolis with the difference that they gave them AV2, which is a mental health screen, and they only did fetal alcohol diagnosis for the individuals who scored high on an AV2. They identified 32% of the population that they were working with who had identifiable FASD. In both cases, in both programs, the youth were on probation. They were given intensive services to teach the people, to teach the probation officers and the individuals in their lives, families, teachers, about FASD, so that they could have a very structured environment. Here in Colorado, before the project started, there was a baseline recidivism rate of 50% in the first year after completion of probation, successful completion of probation, 50% reoffended. The youth who were diagnosed and had their terms and conditions of probation services modified based on FASD, in the 1 to 3 years following successful completion of probation, had a recidivism rate of only 15% rather than 50%. So we were able to make a huge difference in the lives of these youth. So what changes do we need to make to these youth? We're just going to do a very brief overview of how you work with individuals, not just youth, but adults, who have FASD. First of all, we need to distinguish whether the behavior is something that's because they can't understand or can't do something different, or something that they won't do differently. If it's something that they can't do, what we're asking them to do, we have to modify their environment. We're not going to be able to change the way their brain's structured. So we have to modify their environment and work with what they can do, and then modify our expectations so that the things we're expecting from this individual are things that they're capable of doing. And they're basic things. We need to break down the task into simple steps, make them concrete, do it in writing. When Dawnmarie was adolescent, In order for her to learn to wash her clothes, we wrote out, she could read and write, so we wrote out a list of all the steps you have to do to wash and dry clothes. It was 17 steps that she had to follow. Very simple, concrete steps. Today, not a problem, although I suspect she still can't separate her light from her dark clothes. But everything else she can do just fine, and picks her favorite color anyway, so she doesn't care. Her boyfriend washes his own. Talk slowly. Give these individuals time to think through their answer and give you a response. So often we move so quickly in our world that we don't give a person time to respond. Understand that this individual may be able to say things that they can't do. Double check. Try to get them to tell you back what it is that you're asking. Try to be sure that they understand if you can. Be specific. Tell them what you want. Get rid of the word don't. If we tell someone don't do something, what they hear is what we don't want them to do. If we say don't open that bottle of pop, by the time they think through what we said, they've probably already got it open. And then if they do catch that this is something we don't want them to do, they have to figure out what they are supposed to do. So if we just say, please put that down, leave it alone, whatever, tell them what we want, it makes it much easier. Remember, this person's brain is different. Behavior management, logical and natural consequences cannot remove the brain differences. So in summary, probation will be much more effective in rehabilitating this population rather than incarceration. The terms and conditions of probation should fit the individual's abilities and should be written simply and concretely. You need to get as much supervision and structure as possible for these individuals. If the structure is removed, the individual may reoffend. One of the issues that probation officers and others tend to have is as the individual starts acting more appropriately, they think, oh, now they've learned, and they take away the structure that was what was helping the individual to do what they needed to do. They need to do the same thing at the same time in the same way every day. They need to have lists. They need to have reminders. They need to have pictures. They need to do role play so that they can learn, and that structure needs to continue. If they violate the probation, revocation, and reinstatement may be a really good thing for them, because the longer they stay with the structure, the better they're going to do. So what's the prognosis? These individuals, if the structure of probation can be continued, they can lead a life free of crime. They can continue in that pattern. They're always going to need support. That need isn't going to go away. And they're going to be followers. They're going to need a positive peer group, but they can overcome addictions if they have intensive concrete treatment and environmental change. And they very often continue to mature into their 30s. One of the things we see with this population is that their brains do develop and continue to develop and mature beyond what others do. So they may, as they get older, move into a more positive life. And in that light, Dawn, how did you get out of services and become independent? You're 30 years old now.
I always think positively and try not to feel like a victim. I have learned skills over the years that led to more and more independence. After I learned to live on my own, I began to understand that I could use those same skills to help other people like me. Then I was able to get a job working with people with the same kinds of needs that I have.
I think another thing that has helped is that Dawn has learned to understand what her disabilities are and to explain them to people close to her. The biggest problem with this is that people often don't believe her. They don't believe that she has a disability. And even for those that know it's true, it's hard to remember that she actually does have disabilities. Thank you. I believe there's some more. I've got some resources for you on this next slide, if I can get it to change. And then I believe there are more polling questions. Catherine?
All right. Thank you, guys. so much for such a wonderful presentation. I'm going to start reading some questions that we've gotten from the Q&A section, and those of you out there listening, be ready to submit your questions if you have any. Remember that after the webinar, we have a short survey for you to fill out, so please take the time to do that. And now we're going to head back to Eileen and Don and ask some questions. So this first one is from Barb Byers. Barb asks, do you have any strategies on how to support someone with FAS and ID who is reluctant or refusing services?
Of course, no individual is going to be able, is going to work with you if they're totally refusing services, but structure, I think, is the biggest thing, to make their life consistent, to give them those hints, to give them support. And my guess is that those individuals are going to be more willing to accept help if that help is in a positive way of supporting them to do what they want to do rather than trying to impose on them what we think they need.
All right. This next question is from Travis Blevin. Is how do you identify what an individual is capable of and not capable of? And did Dawnmarie surprise you and exceed your expectations and do more than maybe she thought she was capable of? So I guess both of you guys can kind of talk about that.
Yes. Well, let me answer the first part. It's very difficult to identify what a person is capable of and what they're not. That's one of the reasons that we do try to get neuropsychological evaluations done so that we have some idea of what they're capable of and what they're not. Absolutely, Dawn exceeded my expectations. Dawn, did you exceed yours? Yeah. She's gone far beyond what I ever dreamed that she could. However, we've seen it coming over time as she's gotten more and more understanding of herself and her own issues.
That's great. This next question is from Diana Sims. She says, can you say a bit about how you worked with the Colorado Probation Department to modify the terms and conditions of probation for affected individuals?
Well, our particular program was just in the 17th Judicial District. There was, for a time, a program in Denver, just for a short period. The main things that we did were educating people about what to look for. We also had diagnoses for these kids, so we knew what their cognitive deficits were. So then, say that the diagnosis came back saying that this individual thinks slowly, processes slowly, then we would tell everyone that. You know, you don't have to say that this person has fetal alcohol syndrome or has an FASD, but this person processes slowly. So we'd ask the probation officer to slow down, talk slower, be very concrete in what they were asking, and give the individual reminders. And we would go to, in our case, the parents of the kids or the staff where they were living if they weren't living with parents, and teach them the same thing. So whatever the individual's needs were, if their brains were disorganized, then we helped the people in their world to structure their lives for them. If they couldn't follow directions, we helped the people in their lives to remind them of things so that all the people around them were having realistic expectations for these individuals and helping them out when they need to be helped out. Does that answer the question?
Absolutely. This question is for Dawnmarie. Do you think you could ever feel safe with the police again, and what would that take? How can we help people with FASD feel safe with the police?
Not use the police as a bad thing, use it as a positive thing.
So that, like you said, the police would come in and help out?
Not even, yeah, well, and, you know, not talk to them like they're just some criminal that's been there tons of times, you know, talk to them like they're human beings more than, or kind of like a victim. I mean, whether they did something wrong or not, it's still, if you're talking to them so that they don't feel that anger or the like they're, but yeah, mostly I feed off of a lot of emotions. I have facial features, body language. So the more calm they seem to me, the better I'm going to be reacting to them, and the better that I'm going to appreciate them more than be scared of it.
All right, that's great. And a follow-up question, how do we help the broader criminal justice system understand that FASD is a legitimate disability and get them to take time to learn about it as well as others? Sometimes we've seen it's a hard sell.
It is. Unfortunately, that's a difficult issue, but it's one we're working on. It's one of the reasons that we worked so hard to get the American Bar Association to pass that resolution. And by the way, the American Academy of Pediatricians have also come out with statements about FASD as well as the obstetricians. Right now, the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges are working on putting together a tool for judges that will give them education and information about FASD. We just need to spread the word and educate as many people as we can. And I think if the judges can learn to understand this, then it will trickle down if they're asking those questions in court. After 6 years, that happened in our court, that pretty much every time you're in court, the judge asks the question, have we looked at whether this individual has an FASD? That happens both in the delinquency court and in the dependency court.
That's great news. So we're about to wrap up for the day. Do either of you have anything you'd like to add?
Thank you for having this seminar, and you're one way to get the word out.
Absolutely. All right, everyone. Our next webinar will be next month, October 30th at 1:30 p.m., and it will be Day Employment Opportunities for Individuals with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities and Forensic and Sexual Offending Behaviors. So if you have both of those things and you're wondering about different opportunities in your community, hopefully this next webinar will talk a little bit more about that and answer some questions. Don't forget to sign up to receive our email alerts and use our information referral service, and share your story with us at nccjdinfo@thearc.org. All right, this concludes our program for today. Thank you, Eileen and Dawnmarie. This was wonderful, and thank you to everyone that participated. Don't forget to register for our next webinar. See you soon.
Thank you.